The order came before sunrise. Within minutes, a deafening explosion ripped across the Tallow River. The levee had been blown open. Emily Carter froze as a wall of muddy water burst through the breach and raced straight toward the farm her family had spent 11 years building. She had 2 hours. 2 hours to move the livestock. 2 hours to gather whatever could fit in the truck. 2 hours to accept that the cotton she'd spent an entire season raising would never be harvested. This wasn't a natural disaster. Someone had made a choice. The town of Ashworth would stay dry, because Emily's farm was about to disappear beneath the river. By daylight, nothing remained except brown floodwater stretching as far as she could see. Fence posts barely rose above the surface. The fields were gone. 11 years of work had vanished in a single morning. The levee district wrote a compensation check. Neighbors offered their sympathy. Life in Ashworth moved on. Emily's didn't. Then, 8 months later, something happened on that flooded land that no one in Redbud Landing could explain. It drew people back to the very place everyone had already forgotten. And it all traced back to the morning the levee was blown open. If you enjoy stories inspired by real agricultural history and science, hit subscribe right now and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing just how far these stories travel. To understand what really happened, we have to go back to the week the river began to rise. Emily and Thomas Carter had farmed cotton along the Tallow River for 11 years, on ground that sat close enough to the water to flood easily in a bad year and rich enough, most seasons, to make that risk worth taking. The whole of Redbud Landing lived with that same calculation, close to a river that had fed the delta's soil for longer than anyone's memory reached back, contained now by an ambitious new system of levees and floodways the government had built in the years since the last truly catastrophic flood. Most years, the system held, and the river's danger stayed mostly theoretical, a thing older folks in town still talked about but younger farmers like Emily had never fully lived through. That spring, the rain simply didn't stop, and the theoretical danger stopped being theoretical at all. Foster Lang had spent 9 days straight watching river gauge readings climb past every safe threshold the levee district's engineers had planned for, doing the same brutal calculation every flood engineer along that stretch of river eventually had to face. The system couldn't hold everywhere at once, and somewhere, a choice was going to have to be made about where the water went instead. The county seat of Ashworth sat downstream, home to 11,000 people, the courthouse, the rail depot, the hospital. Upstream of it, on the district's own maps, sat a stretch of bottomland cotton acreage that included the Carter farm, chosen not out of any malice toward Emily specifically, but because the math simply worked out that way: lower elevation, fewer structures, a natural spot where a controlled breach could relieve pressure on the town without anyone needing to evacuate a single city block. "I need the order signed by morning," Lang told the district board that night, river gauge readings spread across the table in front of him. "Or we're not choosing between the town and the farms anymore. We're choosing between the town and nothing." The levee gave way exactly where the district's engineers had planned for it to give way, a controlled section blown open in the pre-dawn hours to relieve pressure building dangerously against the town's own stretch of embankment downstream. Emily and Thomas had 2 hours warning, enough time to move what livestock they could and gather what belongings mattered most. Not enough time to save a single row of the cotton crop they'd spent the whole spring bringing along. They worked in near silence through the dark, loading what they could into the truck bed while the sound of the coming water grew steadily louder somewhere beyond the tree line, a low, grinding roar that Emily would remember for years afterward as the sound of watching 11 years of work become something she could no longer protect. Muddy water moved across their bottomland fast and complete once it finally arrived, drowning stalks that had been standing tall and healthy the evening before, turning 11 years of careful, familiar ground into something that looked, by full daylight, like it had simply ceased to exist as farmland at all. Emily stood at the edge of what had been her fence line and watched brown water lap against fence posts that were, by mid-morning, barely visible above the surface. Ashworth held that spring, dry and mostly untouched, exactly the way the district's engineers had calculated it would. Word of the Carter farm's sacrifice traveled through town with a strange, uncomfortable mixture of gratitude and guilt, most people understanding. In the abstract, that somebody's land had needed to take the water so their own homes wouldn't have to. That understanding rarely translated into anything more concrete than sympathy. A few neighbors whose own bottomland had been spared made a point of saying how sorry they were for the Carters' loss, then went back to their own dry, undamaged fields without much more thought on the matter. The district compensated Emily and Thomas modestly for the destroyed crop, a fair enough number on paper, nowhere near what 11 years of built-up soil and standing cotton had actually been worth to them. Emily and Thomas walked their ruined field together once the water finally receded, boots sinking into a thick layer of mud that covered every inch of ground where cotton had stood only weeks before. "Some folks are saying we ought to just let this section rest a full season," Thomas said, scraping mud from his boot heel. "Give it time to recover before we try planting anything in it again." "Maybe," Emily said. She knelt down and pressed her palm flat against the drying mud, feeling something in its texture she couldn't quite name yet. "I don't much feel like waiting a whole season on somebody else's assumption about what this ground can or can't do right now, though. If you've ever had to decide whether to trust your own instinct over everyone else's confident assumption about what you'd lost, tell me in the comments where you're watching from." Because Emily Carter was about to make a decision that would leave this entire county asking questions nobody had good answers for. Subscribe now, because this story only gets more interesting from here. Once the worst of the mud dried through that first week, Emily noticed something that struck her as strange enough to mention to Thomas more than once. The soil underneath had turned dark, almost black in places, finer and richer looking than the ground had ever appeared before the flood took everything standing on top of it. She didn't have a name yet for what she was looking at, no scientific vocabulary to explain why drowned, ruined farmland might look and feel different than it had before the water came through. She just had 11 years of familiarity with her own dirt, and a growing, stubborn curiosity about whether that difference actually meant something. "I don't disagree the dirt looks different," Thomas told her that evening, watching her turn the same handful of soil over for the third time that day. "I just don't know that different means better, Emily. Could just as easily mean ruined in some new way we haven't figured out yet." "Could be," Emily admitted. "But I've farmed this ground 11 years, Thomas. I know what tired dirt looks like. This isn't that." Neighbors who heard about her plan to replant that same ruined section rather than wait out a recovery season mostly reacted with the same gentle, worried skepticism Thomas had voiced at their own kitchen table. Nobody was unkind about it exactly. It simply didn't occur to most of Redbud Landing that flood-drowned ground could be anything other than a loss to be waited out, not a strange kind of gift to be planted into. Carrying fine silt and clay loaded with nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the exact nutrients a growing crop depends on. This is the same basic process that built the fertile floodplains along the Nile and the Tigris-Euphrates. The reason some of humanity's earliest and most productive agricultural civilizations grew up specifically along rivers prone to exactly this kind of flooding. Not every flood behaves this way. A flood that moves too fast, or sits too long on bare cultivated ground, can just as easily strip nutrients away instead of adding them. But a flood that deposits a thin, even layer of nutrient-rich silt across established cropland can genuinely reset that ground's fertility almost overnight. The same natural cycle farmers depended on for thousands of years before modern levees and dams started interrupting it. If you love learning the real science behind a story that looks, on the surface, like pure disaster, subscribe now, because that's exactly the kind of story this channel is built around, episode after episode. Emily and Thomas planted that ruined section that same spring, following the same rotation and spacing they'd have used on any ordinary field, though Emily found herself watching this particular ground more closely than she'd watched any planting in years. The seedlings came up fast, faster than Emily remembered from any previous season on that same acreage, a vigor to the early growth that she noticed but didn't yet trust enough to mention outside her own family. She checked the rows daily through those first weeks, comparing height and color against the same stage of growth in her other fields, keeping careful notes in her tin box the same way she tracked everything else that mattered to the farm's future. Thomas noticed it too, though he was slower to say so out loud than Emily was. "Don't want to get ahead of ourselves," he said, more than once that summer, watching stalks fill in thicker and greener than the surrounding fields that hadn't gone under the flood at all. "But I'll admit, this doesn't look like ruined ground to me anymore." By midsummer, neither of them could pretend not to notice the difference every time they walked that section, a deep, healthy green that stood out even from a distance against everything around it. The properties spared by the levee breach that spring, meanwhile, faced an ordinary growing season with none of the drama the Carters had lived through, but also none of the fresh nutrient boost their flooded neighbors' ground had quietly received. Several operations across the county struggled instead with the usual accumulated strain of continuous cultivation. Soil that hadn't seen anything like a real nutrient reset in years, yields holding steady at best. Nobody made much connection yet between the Carters' unusual growth and the flood that had supposedly ruined their farm. Most of Redbud Landing still thought of that spring's breach as simply a hard loss the Carters had absorbed for the town's benefit, a story with an unambiguous shape everybody already understood. By late summer, the difference had become impossible for anyone driving past the Carter place to miss. Cotton bolls hung thick and heavy across the section that had flooded that spring, a visibly different density and size than the surrounding fields, including some of the county's most carefully managed operations. Word started moving through Redbud Landing the way word always did about anything strange enough to defy easy explanation. Cautious at first, curious, nobody quite ready yet to say out loud what the evidence in front of them seemed to suggest. The Carters brought in that section's harvest in early autumn, and the yield, once weighed and tallied, was unlike anything Emily had recorded in 11 years of careful notes kept in her small tin box, significantly higher than any previous season on that same acreage. Higher than most other operations in the county managed that same year. Word of it reached the State Agricultural Extension Office within the month, the kind of anomaly official channels couldn't simply ignore once enough people in Redbud Landing started asking the same question out loud. How had supposedly ruined, flood-drowned farmland outperformed ground that had never gone underwater at all? Dr. Vivian Ashford arrived from the State Extension Office that October, soil auger and sample jars in hand. Prepared to find some ordinary explanation for what she'd been told was an unusually strong yield on a piece of flood-damaged ground. She tested methodically across the Carter property, comparing samples from the flooded section against samples from neighboring, unflooded fields, running the same tests twice when her first results seemed too dramatic to trust. Nitrogen levels, phosphorus, potassium, organic matter. Every measure came back significantly higher in the section that had drowned under muddy floodwater that spring than in ground the levee district had worked so hard to protect. "I need to be honest with you," she told Emily, reviewing her notes at the kitchen table. "I came out here expecting to explain away a fluke. I don't think this is a fluke." Dr. Ashford spent the better part of that evening walking Emily and Thomas through exactly what her tests had found. A rich, even layer of nutrient-dense silt deposited across the flooded section during the breach, exactly the kind of fertility-resetting sediment river floods have delivered to farmland for as long as human beings have grown crops beside rivers. "The ground the district worked so hard to protect never got this," she said. "It just kept doing what continuously cultivated farmland always does without a reset like this, slowly using up what it already had. Your field got handed something the rest of the county didn't even know it was missing. If you've ever had something that looked like your worst possible loss turn out to be the very thing that saved you, I want to hear that story in the comments tonight." Because Emily Carter didn't just survive being sacrificed for the town's sake. She ended up harvesting more than the town's own protected farmland managed that same year. Subscribe now, because Farm Route Chronicles is full of true stories exactly this strange. Foster Lang drove out to the Carter property that November, the first time he'd set foot on the land since the night he'd signed the order that put it underwater. He walked the harvested rows slowly, running a hand over cut cotton stalks thick enough that even an engineer with no farming background could tell something unusual had happened here. "I made that call to save the town," he said, not quite looking at Emily directly. "I still believe it was the right call. I don't think I ever let myself consider what it actually cost your family beyond the number the district wrote you a check for. It cost us a hard year, Mr. Lang. I won't pretend otherwise. And it gave you this." He gestured at the field, something unreadable moving across his face. "I don't know what to do with that, honestly. I made a decision that was supposed to be a sacrifice, and it turned into the best harvest in the county. I'm not sure the math I do for a living has a column for that. I don't think you owe me an apology for the decision itself, Mr. Lang," Emily said. "You had a town full of people to think about, and I understand the math you were working with that night better than I did at the time." "That's generous of you." "It's not generous. It's just true." Emily looked out at the field, dark rich soil visible between rows of cut stalks. "What I'd ask, if you're willing to hear it, is that the district think a little harder next time about who gets chosen for that kind of sacrifice, and whether there's a way to spread that cost more fairly across a county instead of one family absorbing all of it alone." Lang didn't have an answer for that, not one he could give her on the spot. He just nodded, slowly, and Emily understood that whatever came of the conversation, at least he'd finally let himself sit with the full weight of what his decision had actually meant, in both directions. By the following spring, word of the Carter Farms harvest had traveled well beyond Redbud Landing, and a few of the same neighbors who'd once simply felt sorry for Emily and Thomas started asking genuinely curious questions about what had actually happened to their soil. Dr. Ashford's office used the Carter property as a documented case study in her reports that year, careful to note the specific conditions that had made the difference: a moderate, well-timed flood across established cropland. Not the kind of prolonged, destructive flooding that could just as easily strip a field's fertility instead of restoring it. Emily made a point of explaining that nuance herself whenever anyone asked, unwilling to let her own story get flattened into a simple, misleading lesson that floods were always secretly good for farmland. Emily stood at the edge of her cotton field the following autumn, watching Thomas check the cutting equipment 2 rows down, the same ground that had been standing brown floodwater a year and a half earlier, now carrying the best 2 consecutive harvests either of them had ever recorded. She still kept her small tin box of seed and yield tallies, the numbers from that strange, unexpected season sitting right alongside 11 years of ordinary ones. Not as a trophy, just as a record of exactly how completely a single hard night could turn out to mean something different than anyone standing at that levee breach could have possibly understood at the time. She thought sometimes about how easily the story could have gone the other way, about the neighbors who'd offered their gentle, well-meaning sympathy that first spring, certain they understood exactly what had been lost. The county didn't change everything overnight. The levee district never did formally apologize for choosing her family's ground that spring, and Emily had stopped expecting them to somewhere in the middle of that second good harvest. But nobody in Redbud Landing called it a simple loss anymore, not once the numbers came in 2 years running. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. Everything in this story is grounded in real agricultural science and real history. Floodplain soils are naturally among the most fertile on Earth. And it's not an accident that some of humanity's earliest and most productive agricultural civilizations grew up along rivers prone to regular flooding, from the Nile to the Tigris-Euphrates. When floodwater spreads across flat ground and slows down, it deposits fine, nutrient-rich silt loaded with nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, essentially resetting that ground's fertility in a single event. It's a real, well-documented cycle that farmers depended on for thousands of years before modern levees and dams began interrupting it. It's also true, and important, that not every flood behaves this way. Moderate, well-timed flooding on established cropland tends to improve soil fertility, while prolonged or excessive flooding on bare, heavily cultivated ground can just as easily strip nutrients away and cause lasting damage. The engineered levee and floodway systems in this story are based on a real and still debated practice in American flood management, deliberately sacrificing certain farmland to relieve pressure and protect towns or more valuable property downstream. A real historical practice that has genuinely sparked debate over fairness and compensation. If stories built on real agricultural science and real history are what you come here for, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which detail in this story surprised you the most.